concert hall was packed, a sweltering mass of bodies and the electric hum of anticipation. For 6 months, the anemic musician known as the Piper had been selling out venues across the country. Despite never showing his face, he performed a theatrical and simple, a wind-brimmed hat, casting his features in a permanent shadow. His music wasn't just listened to, it was felt. It was a hypnotic, otherworldly mix of synth, industrial beats, and something that sounded suspiciously like a pipe organ. It got you in your head, under your skin, and pulled you in strong. Sarah was a diehard fan, and tonight was the last show of the tour. She had a front row ticket, a vantage point she had fought tooth and nail for. The lights went out, a hush fell over the crowd, and the stage was bathed in a single crimson spotlight. The Piper emerged in his silhouette, tall and slender against the light. He didn't speak. He simply lifted his long gloved hands, and his music began. It was a low, mournful tone. At first, a single note that vibrated through the floorboards and up through Sarah's feet. As the sound intensified, she felt a strange shift in her precipitation. The world seemed to wobble at the edges, and the faces in the crowd around her seemed to blur, their features meeting and reforming into grotesque masks. The music grew louder, faster, a frantic, pulsing rhythm that pounded against her eardrums. She saw a man a few rows back, began to convulse, his limbs jerking violently. At first, she thought he was dancing, but his movements were unnatural, a parody of joy. His face was a contorted mask of agony, but he made no sound. His jaw was clenched so tight. His teeth were grinding. Panic began to rise in Sarah's throat. She looked to the stage, and for the first time she saw something that wasn't shadow. As the spotlight shifted, a silver of light caught the Piper's face. It wasn't Hannah. It was a pale and gainy stretch tied over a skull-like structure in his eyes. His eyes were two pinpricks of fire. The pipe organ music wasn't coming from an instrument at all. It was the sound of air being forced through his vocal cords, a high, piercing whistle that was sound of immense suffering. She realized what was happening. The Piper wasn't making music for the crowd. He was conducting it. The energy, the hypnotic beats, the overwhelming feeling of joy and chaos were not the result of a performance, but of a possession. He was feeding on joy, and chaos were not the result of a performance, but of a possession. He was feeding on their emotions, their magic joy, their unspoken anxieties, and in return he was forcing their otherworldly power into them. The man convulsing wasn't just dancing, he was being torn apart from the inside out. The music reached a fever pitch. A woman in the row behind Sarah let out a soundless scream, her hands crawling at her own feet. The crowd of a moment ago, a single entity of communal joy, was now a fractured collection of individuals, each one fighting a silent internal battle. Yet no one was leaving. They couldn't. They were all rooted in place, their feet unwillingly to move, their eyes unable to look away from the stage. The Piper had them trapped. Sarah, a wave of cold dread washing over her, looked at her own hands. They were trembling, but not from fear. They weren't trembling with a natural, violent energy, a compulsion to clap, to scream, to give in to the rhythm. Say fought it. Her every muscle screaming in protest. She closed her eyes, envisaging a strength she didn't know she had. Forced her hands into her pockets. He opened her eyes and saw him looking directly at her. The two pinpricks of fire in his eyes burned with a malevolent intelligence. The music changed. The pulsing rhythm began to slow. Deliberate march. He held out one gloved hand, gesturing towards her, and a voice, not in her ears, but in her mind, soothed in. Join us, it hissed. With the final departure surge of wills, Sarah forced her legs to move. She didn't walk. She crawled, scrambling over. She tasseled the side of her fellow fans who were lost in a frenzied, silent trance. She crawled her way to the back of the hall. Her hands and knees scraped raw on the concrete. She felt the pull of the music, the mental chains trying to sharpen back into place, but she pushed on a single point of resistance. In a sea of complete submission, she finally stumbled out of the hall and into the cool night air. The sound of the music, a low Mandarin pulse, was still a part of her echoing in her skull. She looked back at the doors of the concert hall. They were shut tight, and far within she could hear it in a low, rhythmic sound. It wasn't music anymore. It was a rhythmic tapping, like thousands of tiny skeletal ringers beating against a drum. The piper was no longer performing. He was feeding. The concert gore those were still inside would never end. The stadium was a cathedral of noise, a roaring, seething sea of red and black. It was the final game of the season, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Quarterback Jake Tanner, a legend in the making, stood in the huddle, the cold night air biting at his skin. His team, the Ravens, was down by 6 points with only 20 seconds left on the clock. It was a Hail Mary situation, and every eye in the stands was on him. What nobody knew was that Jake had a secret, a weight he'd carried all season. It started with a whisper he'd heard during a preseason practice, a low, guttural voice that spoke only to him, just loud enough to cut through the din. "Throw it," it would say when a receiver was wide open, or "run it yourself" when the play was a pass. And when he obeyed, the play was always perfect. His throws were laser-guided, his decisions flawless. He was having the season of his life, but it wasn't his. He was a puppet, and the voice was pulling the strings. In the huddle, the voices were a low hum in his ear. "Roll left," it instructed. "Look for the tight end, throw it high." Jake nodded, feeling a cold dread settle in his stomach. The play was a complete reversal of their usual Hail Mary. He looked at his teammates, their faces a mixture of fear and desperate hope. He saw a flicker of doubt in their eyes, and he knew that they were trusting him to deliver. The ball was snapped. The defensive line surged forward, a wall of flesh and fury. Jake dropped back, feinted right, and then rolled left, just as the voice had commanded. He scanned the field. His wide receiver, their star player, was cutting across the field, but he was covered. The tight end was a lost cause. 2 defenders on him like shadows. It was a terrible play, a guaranteed interception. The voice, however, grew louder, more insistent. "Now, throw it, now." Panic seized him. He ignored the voice. He saw his wide receiver breaking free just for a second. It was a risky pass, but it was their only chance. He wound up his arm, ready to throw it, and then he felt it. Not a voice, but a physical presence. It was on his arm, a freezing, skeletal grip that stopped his motion mid-throw. The strength was inhuman, and he cried out in shock. He looked down, and for a split second he saw it. a pale, translucent hand with long, blackened fingernails wrapped around his wrist. "I said, now," the voice hissed, and it wasn't in his head anymore. It was right next to his ear. A frigid breath on his skin. The otherworldly force twisted his arm, forcing him to release the ball. It sailed through the air, an errant, fluttering duck, not towards the wide receiver, but directly towards the tight end, who was still double covered. The crowd groaned, the sound of defeat. An opposing player leapt, his hands outstretched, ready to make the easy interception. But the ball, instead of being caught, seemed to defy physics. It curved in midair, a slow, deliberate arc, as if guided by an invisible hand. The defender's finger brushed the leather, but it was just enough to tip the ball. The tight end, having given up on the play, turned just in time to have the ball fall directly into his hands. Touchdown. The stadium erupted. The Ravens had won. Jake's teammates hoisted him onto their shoulders, cheering and slapping his back, but Jake could only stare at his hand, the one that had been held by the unseen force. A faint, glowing red mark, like a burn, was etched into his wrist. The voice was gone, but the presence remained, a cold emptiness at his side. He went on to win the Super Bowl. He was the most celebrated athlete in the nation, but every game, every play, he felt the icy grip on his arm and heard the whispered commands. The voice, it seemed, was never truly gone. It simply found its new home and had forever claimed its perfect, obedient quarterback. The fog rolled in, thick and soupy, swallowing the dotted yellow lines of the highway hull. Jake squinted, leaning forward over the steering wheel of his 18-wheeler. The familiar groan of the diesel engine, his only company on the desolate stretch of I-80 in Nevada. He'd been pushing hard for 2 days straight, chasing a delivery deadline that felt less like a job and more like a cruel joke. His eyes were gritty, his mind hazy with exhaustion. That's when he saw it, a figure standing right in the middle of his lane. He slammed on the brakes, the air hiss of the truck's pressure system screaming in the sudden silence. The rig shuddered, groaning to a halt, inches from the figure. It wasn't a hitchhiker. It was a woman, in a tattered white dress, her hair long and black, hanging limp and wet. She was staring directly at him, but her eyes, there were nothing there, just black, empty sockets. Panic coiled in his stomach. He wasn't a man who believed in ghosts, but what he was seeing defied every logical explanation. She didn't move. She just stood there, her head slightly tilted, her hands hanging loosely at her sides. He fumbled for the CB radio, but his hand was shaking too hard to key the mic. He honked his horn. The sound was a pathetic bleat against the suffocating silence. The woman didn't even flinch. She just kept staring at him, and an oversettling sensation began to creep over him. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was a cold, alien recognition, as if he knew her from a half-forgotten dream. Desperate, he threw the truck into reverse and backed up, his tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. He swung the rig wide, intending to go around her, to leave her to the fog and the endless road. But as he passed the spot where she had stood, he saw something in his side view mirror. The woman wasn't there. Instead, her reflection was in the passenger side window of his cab, a ghostly silhouette surmised over his own reflection. She was inside. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the night air. He floored the gas, the diesel engine roaring to life as he sped away. but the image in the window didn't disappear. It was a faint, distorted shadow, but he could make out the dark, empty holes where her eyes should have been. As he drove faster, the reflection seemed to press against the glass, growing clearer, more defined. He could see the tears in her dress, the gaunt lines of her face. Then a faint whisper snarked through the cab, a dry, raspy voice sound that seemed to come from all around him. "You drive too fast," it hissed. "You'll lose it all." Jake's heart hammered against his ribs. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. He was hallucinating. That was it. Lack of sleep, the stress. He just needed to find the next truck stop. He crested a small hill, and his headlights cut through a brief break in the fog. In the distance, he saw a flickering sign for a gas station. Hope surged through him. A moment later, the fog closed in again, but the sign's light still pulsed, beckoning him forward. He hit the brakes to slow down as he approached the turnoff, but the trucks didn't respond. The brakes were gone. He pumped the pedal again and again, but nothing happened. He fought with the steering wheel, trying to keep the rig from flying off the road, but it was wrestling with a ghost. The truck accelerated on its own, an engine of demonic growl. Then from the passenger seat, he felt a cold, a delicate touch on his shoulder. He glanced over, and there she was, sitting right beside him. Her face was inches from his, her black, empty eye sockets staring into his soul. Her lips cracked and dry, parted in a soundless smile. "I told you," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "You drive too fast." Jake screamed, a raw, primal sound of terror. He jerked the wheel, but it was too late. The truck veered off the road and hurtled into the night. The distant light of the gas station, the last thing he ever saw. The next morning, the state trooper found the wreck of an 18-wheeler wrapped around a redwood tree. There was no sign of the driver, just a single tattered white dress tangled in the broken windshield.